Picture this. A 65-year-old grandmother stands frozen at airport security, watching a TSA agent hold her most precious possession, a silver cross that belonged to her late mother. The agent's scanner is beeping frantically, and his eyes narrow with suspicion. "Ma'am, this jewelry contains electronic components. I need to confiscate this immediately." What the agent doesn't know is that inside that cross lies technology that could mean the difference between life and death. And what happens next will restore your faith in human decency when the system fails those who need it most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria Santos adjusted the silver cross around her neck for the 100th time that morning, her weathered fingers tracing the familiar engravings that had comforted her mother through 43 years of marriage and now brought her own racing heart some measure of peace. The cross wasn't just jewelry, it was a lifeline, both spiritual and literal. Hidden within its ancient silver frame was a GPS tracking device, smaller than a watch battery, that monitored her heart rhythm and could summon emergency medical assistance if her recently repaired cardiac system decided to fail her at 30,000 feet. Denver International Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos of Thanksgiving week travel. Families clutched boarding passes like golden tickets. Children dragged oversized backpacks behind them, and the intercom system announced delays in 3 languages every few minutes. Maria had arrived 4 hours early, not because she was particularly anxious about flying, but because her daughter Carmen had insisted. "Mom, with your heart condition, we can't take any chances. Get there early, take your time, and call me the second you board." The call had come 6 days ago, Carmen's voice, thick with exhaustion and joy, crackling through the phone line from Phoenix. "Mom, she's here! Little Isabella arrived this morning, and she's perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and she has your eyes." Maria had wept then, clutching the phone to her chest, feeling her rebuilt heart skip in ways that had nothing to do with medical complications and everything to do with the miracle of new life entering their family. This would be Maria's first flight since the surgery 3 months ago. Dr. Patterson had cleared her for travel, but only with strict conditions. Wear the medical alert cross at all times. Keep her medications in her carry-on bag. Have the hospital discharge papers readily available. And most importantly, never let anyone remove the GPS tracking device, because if her heart stopped beating regularly, the signal would immediately alert emergency services to her exact location. The cross had been her mother's wedding gift in 1962, blessed by Father Rodriguez at St. Catherine's Church in the same ceremony where Maria had been baptized as an infant. When her mother passed 5 years ago, the cross became Maria's most treasured inheritance. After the heart attack that nearly killed her last spring, Dr. Chen at Presbyterian Hospital had suggested the GPS modification. "We can hide the medical device inside something you already wear every day," he'd explained. "That way, you'll never forget it, and it becomes part of your natural routine." The technology was remarkable. The tiny device monitored her heart rate, detected irregular rhythms, and could pinpoint her location within 3 feet anywhere in the world. If her heart rate spiked dangerously or dropped too low, the device would automatically contact emergency services and provide her exact coordinates, along with her complete medical history. For someone living alone after 42 years of marriage, it meant the difference between dying alone on her kitchen floor and getting help in time to see her granddaughter take her first steps. Maria had worn the cross every day since the modification, through physical therapy sessions, grocery store trips, and church services where Father O'Brien always smiled when he saw it glinting in the sanctuary light. It had become as natural as breathing, as automatic as checking her blood pressure each morning. The cross represented everything she was fighting to stay alive for: faith, family, and the promise of watching Isabella grow up. Now, standing in the security line at gate B12, Maria felt the familiar weight of the cross against her chest and said a small prayer for smooth travels. The line moved slowly, typical for holiday travel, giving her time to observe the controlled ballet of airport security. TSA agents moved with practiced efficiency, their hands swift and sure as they guided bins through X-ray machines and waved travelers through metal detectors. Everything seemed routine, professional, unremarkable. Kevin Walsh had been working airport security for 8 months, and he approached every shift with the zealous dedication of someone who'd found his calling in life. At 28, he was already being considered for a supervisory position, largely because of his attention to detail and unwavering commitment to protocol. Kevin didn't believe in exceptions, gray areas, or judgment calls. Rules existed for a reason, and his job was to enforce them without bias or sentiment. The morning briefing had emphasized increased vigilance during the holiday travel season. Passenger volume was up 30%, and stress levels were high. Watch for anything unusual, Supervisor Martinez had instructed. Electronic devices hidden in jewelry, unusual metal objects, anything that doesn't belong. When in doubt, confiscate first and ask questions later. Better safe than sorry. Kevin had nodded along with the other agents, already mentally cataloging the various ways passengers tried to circumvent security measures. He'd seen it all: knives hidden in belt buckles, liquid explosives disguised as shampoo, electronic devices modified to look like innocent accessories. The job required constant vigilance, and Kevin prided himself on never missing anything suspicious. When Maria approached his station, Kevin's trained eye immediately noticed the cross around her neck. It was substantial, clearly old, and when she passed through the metal detector, it triggered a soft beep that indicated the presence of electronics. Kevin's scanner confirmed what his instincts had already told him. This wasn't just jewelry. "Ma'am, I need you to remove that necklace and place it in the bin for separate screening," Kevin instructed, his voice carrying the authority of 8 months' experience and absolute certainty in his own judgment. Maria's hand instinctively moved to the cross, her fingers closing protectively around the silver surface. "Officer, this is a medical device. I have documentation from my doctor explaining why I need to wear it at all times." She reached into her purse for the letter Dr. Chen had provided, the one explaining the GPS tracker's life-saving function and recommending that security personnel contact the hospital directly if they had any questions. Kevin barely glanced at the paperwork. He'd seen fake medical documents before, elaborate forgeries designed to smuggle prohibited items onto aircraft. "Ma'am, my scanner indicates electronic components in that jewelry. I need to examine it separately. Please remove it now and place it in the bin." The request felt like a physical blow to Maria's chest. Remove the cross? The one thing standing between her and potential cardiac arrest at 37,000 feet? The device that would summon help if her repaired heart decided to give out somewhere over the Colorado Rockies? "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. This device monitors my heart condition. Without it, if something happens during the flight, no one will know where I am or what's wrong." Kevin's expression hardened. He'd heard every excuse in the book, and he'd learned not to let passenger sob stories interfere with his professional judgment. "Ma'am, you can either remove the necklace voluntarily, or I'll need to call my supervisor and we can discuss this in a more private setting. But that jewelry is not going through security screening while you're wearing it." Around them, the security line was backing up. Other passengers began glancing over, some checking their watches, others shaking their heads at what appeared to be another travel delay caused by an uncooperative traveler. Maria felt the weight of their attention, the impatience in their sighs, the assumption that she was being difficult for no good reason. "Please," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the dignity of 65 years and the desperation of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Just call the number on this letter. Dr. Chen can explain everything about the device. It's not dangerous. It's keeping me alive." But Kevin had already made his decision. 8 months of training had taught him that hesitation led to security breaches, and security breaches led to disasters that made international headlines. He pressed the button on his radio. "Supervisor Martinez to Station 12. Need assistance with non-compliant passenger refusing to surrender prohibited electronic device." The words hit Maria like ice water. Non-compliant. Prohibited. Refusing to surrender. In the span of 30 seconds, she'd transformed from a grandmother excited to meet her first grandchild into some kind of security threat, a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be helped. Rosa Martinez arrived within minutes, her supervisor's badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was a 15-year veteran of airport security, and she'd seen every type of passenger conflict imaginable. But when she looked at Maria, a well-dressed elderly woman clutching medical documentation and wearing what appeared to be a simple religious cross, something about the situation didn't feel right. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rosa asked, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd learned to diffuse tense situations before they escalated. Kevin straightened, eager to demonstrate his adherence to protocol. "Passenger is refusing to remove jewelry containing electronic components. Scanner confirms the presence of a tracking device." She claims it's medical, but I can't verify the authenticity of her documentation." Rosa looked at Maria, taking in the trembling hands, the careful way she held herself, the unmistakable signs of someone recovering from serious illness. "Ma'am, may I see your medical documentation?" Maria handed over Dr. Chen's letter with hands that shook slightly from a combination of medication side effects and rising anxiety. The letter was thorough, printed on official hospital letterhead, and included Dr. Chen's direct phone number for verification. It explained the GPS device's function, its life-saving importance, and specifically requested that security personnel contact the cardiology department if they had any questions about the device's necessity. Rosa read the letter twice, her expression growing more concerned with each paragraph. This wasn't some elaborate ruse to smuggle contraband onto an aircraft. This was a heart patient whose life literally depended on the medical device Kevin was trying to confiscate. "Mrs. Santos," Rosa said gently, "I understand your concern about the device. Can you tell me more about how it works?" Maria's voice steadied as she explained the technology Dr. Chen had so carefully described to her months earlier. The GPS tracker monitored her heart rhythm continuously, storing data about rate, regularity, and any dangerous fluctuations. If her heart rate spiked above 120 beats per minute or dropped below 45, the device would automatically transmit her location and medical information to an emergency response network that included her doctor, local emergency services, and the hospital where her records were stored. "During my flight to Phoenix, if something goes wrong with my heart, this device is the only way anyone will know where I am or how to help me," Maria explained. "Without it, I could have a cardiac episode at cruising altitude, and by the time the plane could make an emergency landing, it might be too late." Rosa glanced at Kevin, who was clearly growing impatient with what he perceived as unnecessary delay and excessive accommodation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They were bending over backward for one passenger while dozens of others waited in line. All because an elderly woman was being stubborn about removing a piece of jewelry. "Supervisor Martinez," Kevin interjected, his voice tight with frustration. "With all due respect, we can't start making exceptions for every passenger who claims their prohibited items are medically necessary. If we let her through with unscanned electronics, what's to stop the next person from claiming their concealed device is also medical?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Rosa found herself caught between competing priorities. Security protocols existed for valid reasons, and Kevin's concerns about setting precedents weren't entirely unreasonable. But she was looking at a woman whose life genuinely depended on the device they were trying to confiscate, and every instinct told her that treating Maria Santos like a security threat was both wrong and potentially dangerous. "Let me call the number on this letter," Rosa decided. "If Dr. Chen can verify the device and its necessity, we'll figure out a way to screen it without putting Mrs. Santos at risk." But when Rosa dialed the number, she reached Dr. Chen's answering service. The cardiology department was in surgery until 3 o'clock, and it was currently 10:30 in the morning. Maria's flight was scheduled to depart at noon. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Santos, but your doctor isn't available to verify the device right now. Is there anyone else who can confirm the medical necessity?" Maria felt the walls closing in around her. Carmen was in Phoenix with a 6-hour-old baby. Her primary care physician was Dr. Patterson, but his office wouldn't open until noon on the day before Thanksgiving. The hospital had her records, but accessing them would require paperwork and authorization that could take hours to process. "I have my discharge papers from the surgery," Maria offered, pulling out a folder thick with medical documents. "They list all my medications, the details about the pacemaker, and the recommendation for continuous cardiac monitoring." Kevin shook his head before Rosa could respond. "Those papers don't specifically mention the GPS device. For all we know, she had the electronics installed after her medical treatment. I can't let potentially dangerous technology through security based on generic medical paperwork." The word dangerous echoed through Maria's mind like a bell tolling. Dangerous. Her mother's cross, blessed by Father Rodriguez and worn through decades of prayers, Christmases, and family celebrations, was now being classified as dangerous. The device that could save her life was being treated as a threat to everyone else's safety. "Ma'am," Kevin continued, his voice taking on the impatient edge of someone who'd spent too much time on what should have been a simple security check. "I'm going to need you to remove the necklace now and surrender it for confiscation, or I'll have to call airport police and have you removed from the security area." The threat of police involvement sent a shockwave through Maria's system that her GPS device immediately detected. Her heart rate spiked to 135 beats per minute, well above the normal range, and the tiny computer inside her cross began its automated emergency protocol. Within 30 seconds, Dr. Chen's emergency service would receive an alert that Maria Santos was experiencing cardiac distress at Denver International Airport, Terminal B, Security Checkpoint 12. But Maria didn't know about the automated alert. All she knew was that her carefully planned trip to meet her granddaughter was disintegrating into a nightmare of bureaucracy and misunderstanding. The stress was making her chest tight, her breathing shallow, and she could feel the familiar flutter in her rebuilt heart that meant her body was approaching its limits. "Please don't call the police," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the airport noise. "I just want to see my granddaughter. She was born yesterday, and this is my first chance to meet her. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just need to keep this device with me so I don't die on the airplane." The raw desperation in her voice caused several nearby passengers to look over with concern. An elderly man in a veteran's cap stepped closer, his expression troubled. A young mother with 2 small children glanced up from her phone, clearly disturbed by what she was witnessing. Even other TSA agents were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening at Station 12. But Kevin remained unmoved. 8 months of training had taught him that emotional manipulation was a common tactic used by passengers trying to circumvent security measures. Sob stories, medical emergencies, family crises. He'd heard them all, and he'd learned not to let sympathy interfere with his professional judgment. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but rules are rules. I can't make exceptions based on personal circumstances. Either remove the necklace voluntarily, or I'll need to escalate this situation to airport police." Rosa Martinez watched the scene unfold with growing unease. She'd been in airport security long enough to distinguish between genuine distress and theatrical manipulation, and everything about Maria Santos screamed genuine. The woman's color was poor, her hands were trembling, and she was displaying all the signs of someone experiencing real medical anxiety. "Kevin," Rosa said quietly, "maybe we should." "Supervisor Martinez," Kevin interrupted, his voice sharp with professional certainty. "We can't start making emotional decisions about security protocols. If this device is as innocent as she claims, she can check it with her luggage and pick it up in Phoenix. But it's not going through security screening while she's wearing it." The suggestion was so profoundly wrong that Maria actually staggered backward. Check her life-saving medical device with her luggage? The GPS tracker that needed to maintain constant contact with her body to monitor her heart rhythm? The device that could summon emergency help if she went into cardiac arrest during the flight? "You don't understand," Maria said, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "This isn't jewelry I can take off and put back on later. This is medical equipment that has to stay with me at all times. If I have a heart attack during the flight and this device is in the cargo hold, I will die. No one will know what's wrong with me or how to help me." But Kevin had already made his decision. He pressed his radio button again. Station 12 requesting airport police assistance. Passenger refusing to comply with security screening requirements. The words seemed to echo through the terminal like a pronouncement of doom. Airport police. Non-compliance. Security screening requirements. In the span of 15 minutes, Maria Santos had gone from excited grandmother to suspected security threat, all because she refused to surrender the one thing keeping her alive. As Kevin waited for backup to arrive, he felt confident in his actions. He'd followed protocol to the letter, maintained security standards, and refused to let emotional manipulation compromise his professional judgment. In his mind, he was protecting hundreds of passengers from potential danger, even if it meant disappointing one elderly woman who'd tried to bend the rules with a sob story about meeting her granddaughter. What Kevin didn't know was that at that very moment, Dr. Chen's emergency monitoring service was receiving an automated alert from Maria's GPS device. Heart rate critically elevated. Patient experiencing severe distress. Location: Denver International Airport, Terminal B, Security Checkpoint 12. Recommend immediate medical intervention. The cavalry was about to arrive, but not in the way anyone expected. The first airport police officer to arrive was Sergeant Lisa Thompson, a 20-year veteran who'd seen every type of passenger disturbance imaginable. Drunk businessmen, panicked families, confused elderly travelers who'd wandered into restricted areas. But when she approached Security Checkpoint 12 and saw a trembling grandmother surrounded by TSA agents, her experienced instincts told her something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. "What's the nature of the problem?" Sergeant Thompson asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Kevin straightened to his full height, eager to demonstrate his professionalism to law enforcement. "Passenger is refusing to surrender prohibited electronic device for security screening. She's been non-compliant for over 20 minutes and is causing a backup in the security line." Sergeant Thompson looked at Maria, taking in the medical alert bracelet on her wrist, the careful way she held herself, and the unmistakable pallor of someone experiencing significant stress. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's happening here?" Maria's voice wavered as she explained the situation once again, her words coming in short bursts as her breathing became more labored. The stress was taking its toll on her cardiovascular system, and she could feel her heart working harder than it should. "Officer, this cross contains a GPS device that monitors my heart condition. If I remove it, and something happens during my flight, no one will know where I am or how to help me." "She claims it's medical," Kevin interjected. "But she can't provide adequate verification. The device could be anything: a recording device, a transmitter, even an explosive component. I can't let unverified electronics through security based on a passenger's word." Sergeant Thompson frowned as she examined the letter from Dr. Chen. The documentation looked legitimate, complete with hospital letterhead and detailed medical information. But she also understood Kevin's position. Airport security couldn't make exceptions without proper verification, especially during high-alert periods like holiday travel. "Mrs. Santos, is there anyone else who can verify this device's medical necessity? Another doctor, perhaps, or someone at the hospital?" Maria felt hope flickering in her chest. "Dr. Patterson is my primary care physician, but his office is closed today. The hospital has all my records, but they said it would take hours to get authorization to release them." "Hours we don't have," Kevin added pointedly. "Her flight boards in 45 minutes. Either she complies with security screening now, or she misses her flight." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword over Maria's head. Miss her flight to Phoenix, disappoint Carmen, who was waiting with little Isabella, and lose the money she'd saved for months to make this trip, or surrender the device that could save her life if her heart decided to fail somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. Sergeant Thompson was weighing her options when her radio crackled to life. "All units, be advised we have a medical alert for the terminal. Emergency services reporting GPS medical device activation in Terminal B. Patient identified as Maria Santos, age 65, cardiac patient experiencing distress." The words hit the group like lightning. Maria's GPS device hadn't just been monitoring her heart rate, it had been actively transmitting data to emergency services. And right now, that data was screaming that she was in medical trouble. "That's impossible," Kevin said immediately. "The device is right here around her neck. How could it be transmitting anything?" Sergeant Thompson looked at Maria with new understanding. "Mrs. Santos, is your device currently active?" Maria nodded weakly. "It monitors my heart continuously. When my heart rate gets too high or too low, it automatically contacts emergency services with my location and medical information." "And what's your heart rate right now?" Sergeant Thompson asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I don't know exactly, but it feels fast. This whole situation has me very upset and anxious, which isn't good for my condition." Kevin's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. If the device was legitimate, if it really was monitoring Maria's heart condition, then he'd just spent 20 minutes stressing a cardiac patient, to the point where her medical equipment was automatically summoning emergency help. His zealous adherence to protocol might have created the very emergency he'd been trying to prevent. "Sergeant Thompson," came another voice over the radio. Presbyterian Hospital Emergency Department is requesting immediate welfare check on Maria Santos at Denver International. Patient's cardiac monitoring device indicates severe distress and possible medical emergency in progress. The radio calls were drawing attention from other passengers, TSA supervisors, and airport staff. Word was spreading that there was a medical emergency at security checkpoint 12, and people were beginning to crane their necks to see what was happening. Maria found herself at the center of a growing circle of concerned faces, all trying to understand why an elderly woman with obvious health problems was being detained by airport security. Dr. Robert Chen was just finishing his morning surgery when the emergency alert came through on his phone. The message was brief but alarming. Patient Maria Santos experiencing cardiac distress. GPS device activated. Location: Denver International Airport. Immediate medical consultation requested. Dr. Chen knew Maria's case intimately. She'd been one of his most challenging patients, a woman whose heart had been so badly damaged by her initial attack that the repair surgery had been touch and go for several hours. The GPS modification to her mother's cross had been his idea, a way to ensure that if her heart failed again, help would find her within minutes rather than hours. He immediately called Denver International's medical emergency line. "This is Dr. Chen from Presbyterian Hospital Cardiology. I have a patient, Maria Santos, whose medical monitoring device is indicating a cardiac emergency at your location. She's a high-risk patient who recently underwent major heart surgery. I need to speak with whoever is handling her situation immediately." The call was transferred to Airport Medical Services, then to Terminal Security, and finally to Sergeant Thompson's radio. When Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the speaker, explaining Maria's condition and the critical importance of her GPS device, the atmosphere around Security Checkpoint 12 shifted dramatically. "Officer," Dr. Chen's voice carried the authority of medical expertise, "Mrs. Santos is a post-surgical cardiac patient. The device she's wearing isn't just jewelry, it's life-saving medical equipment that I personally recommended and had installed. If you remove that device, you're essentially cutting off her connection to emergency medical services." Kevin felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "Doctor, how do I know this call is legitimate? Anyone could claim to be a physician." "Transfer me to your medical facility," Dr. Chen replied calmly. "I'll verify my credentials with your on-site medical staff and fax over Mrs. Santos's complete medical records within 5 minutes. Rosa Martinez, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern, stepped forward. "Kevin, I think we need to reconsider our approach here." But Kevin was in too deep to back down gracefully. 20 minutes of insisting that Maria was non-compliant, that her device was potentially dangerous, that exceptions couldn't be made. To admit now that he'd been wrong would mean acknowledging that he'd traumatized a heart patient and potentially endangered her life through his inflexibility. "Supervisor Martinez, we still haven't verified that this device is safe for air travel. GPS transmitters could interfere with aircraft navigation systems." Dr. Chen's voice came through the radio again, this time with an edge of frustrated authority. "Officer, I can hear you discussing aircraft safety concerns. Let me be absolutely clear. The GPS device in Mrs. Santos's cross is FAA approved for air travel. It's the same technology used in aircraft emergency beacons. It will not interfere with navigation systems, and removing it from a cardiac patient could result in her death." The word "death" seemed to echo through the security area. Other passengers were openly staring now, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a significant incident. Maria stood in the center of it all, feeling like her private medical crisis had become a public spectacle. Airport Medical Services arrived next, led by paramedic James Wilson. He'd received the emergency call about a cardiac patient in distress and had expected to find someone collapsed on the floor, not a woman standing upright but clearly in significant emotional and physical distress. "Mrs. Santos?" Paramedic Wilson approached with the calm professionalism of someone trained to handle medical emergencies. "I'm James Wilson, Airport Medical Services. We received an alert from your monitoring device. How are you feeling right now?" Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "My chest feels tight, and my heart is racing. I've been very upset about this whole situation. Paramedic Wilson immediately began taking her vital signs while Dr. Chen continued providing medical information through the radio. Maria's blood pressure was elevated, her heart rate was 142 beats per minute, and she was showing signs of the kind of stress that could trigger another cardiac episode in someone with her medical history. "Ma'am, I'm going to recommend that we transport you to the hospital for evaluation," Paramedic Wilson said gently. "Your vital signs indicate that you're under significant stress, which isn't safe given your recent heart surgery." The suggestion hit Maria like a physical blow. Transport to the hospital meant missing her flight. Missing her flight meant disappointing Carmen and not meeting Isabella. After months of planning, saving money, and looking forward to this moment, her trip was disintegrating because a security agent refused to believe that her mother's cross contained legitimate medical equipment. "Please," Maria said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I just want to see my granddaughter. She was born yesterday, and this is my only chance to visit before Christmas. Can't someone just verify that my device is safe?" Kevin watched Maria break down and felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. This wasn't how he'd imagined his career-making arrest going. Instead of catching a potential terrorist, he seemed to have traumatized a grandmother whose only crime was wearing medical equipment that looked suspicious to his scanner. But admitting error at this point would mean acknowledging that his judgment had been flawed from the beginning. That he'd escalated a simple medical situation into a major incident involving police, paramedics, and now hospital personnel. That his strict adherence to protocol had created chaos instead of ensuring safety. "The device still hasn't been properly screened," Kevin insisted, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Even if it's medical, we need to verify that it's not modified or tampered with." Dr. Chen's response came through the radio with barely contained frustration. "Officer, I can provide you with the serial number, manufacturer specifications, and installation records for that device. I can have the manufacturer's technical support team confirm its safety features within 10 minutes. What exactly would constitute adequate verification for you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kevin had spent so much time insisting that the device couldn't be verified that he'd backed himself into a corner where no amount of verification would allow him to change course without losing face. Sergeant Thompson, who had been quietly observing the escalating situation, made a decision. "Kevin, I think we need to step back and reassess this situation. We have a cardiac patient whose medical device is indicating distress, a doctor providing verification of the device's legitimacy, and airport medical services recommending hospital transport. Maybe it's time to consider that this woman isn't a security threat." "But the protocol," Kevin began. "The protocol," Sergeant Thompson interrupted firmly, "is designed to keep passengers safe. Right now, our actions are putting a passenger in danger." As if to emphasize her point, Paramedic Wilson looked up from his equipment with concern. "Mrs. Santos, your heart rate is now 150 beats per minute. I really need to transport you for medical evaluation." Maria felt the world tilting around her. Everything she'd worked toward, planned for, dreamed about, was slipping away because a young man with a badge had decided that her mother's cross was a security threat. The stress was making her chest tighten, her breathing shallow, and she could feel her rebuilt heart struggling to cope with the emotional and physical demands of the situation. "I don't want to go to the hospital," she whispered. "I want to see my granddaughter." Father Michael O'Brien had been finishing his morning rounds in the airport chapel when he received a call from Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Chen had remembered that Maria was a parishioner at St. Catherine's and that the airport chaplain might be able to provide character verification for a woman caught in an impossible situation. "Father O'Brien," Dr. Chen had explained, "I have a patient at your airport who's being detained by security because they don't believe her medical device is legitimate. Maria Santos. She's elderly, recently had heart surgery, and she's traveling to see her first grandchild. The stress is putting her in real medical danger." Father O'Brien knew Maria well. She'd been a faithful parishioner for over 30 years, had taught Sunday school, organized countless charity drives, and had nursed her husband through his final illness with grace and dignity. The idea that she was being treated as a security threat was both heartbreaking and infuriating. He arrived at Security Checkpoint 12 to find Maria surrounded by TSA agents, police officers, and paramedics, looking small and fragile in the center of what had clearly become a major incident. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking, and she had the look of someone whose world was falling apart. "Maria," Father O'Brien said gently, approaching through the crowd of officials. "It's Father O'Brien from the airport chapel. Dr. Chen called and told me you were having some difficulties." Maria's face lit up with relief at seeing a familiar face. "Father, they want to take away my mother's cross. The one with the medical device that Dr. Chen installed. They think it's dangerous." Father O'Brien turned to address the assembled officials, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to providing comfort in crisis situations. "Gentlemen, I've known Maria Santos for over 30 years. She's a woman of impeccable character who has devoted her life to serving others. The cross she's wearing belonged to her mother and was blessed at our church. The idea that she would use it to conceal something dangerous is absolutely preposterous." Kevin felt increasingly isolated as more and more people arrived to vouch for Maria's character and the legitimacy of her medical device. But he'd committed so completely to his position that changing course now felt like professional suicide. "Father, with all due respect, character references don't address the technical security concerns about unscanned electronic devices." "Then let's address those concerns properly," came a new voice from the crowd. Captain Jennifer Hayes had been passing through security on her way to pilot the 12:15 flight to Phoenix when she noticed the commotion. As a commercial airline pilot with 15 years of experience, she was intimately familiar with aircraft safety systems and the types of electronic devices that could pose genuine threats to navigation equipment. "I'm Captain Hayes, and I'll be piloting the flight Mrs. Santos is scheduled to take," she announced to the group. I couldn't help but overhear the discussion about GPS devices and aircraft safety. "Officer, may I ask what specific concerns you have about this medical equipment?" Kevin felt like he was being cross-examined by an expert witness. "The device contains GPS transmitters that could potentially interfere with aircraft navigation systems." Captain Hayes shook her head with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused student. "Officer, GPS devices are passive receivers. They don't transmit signals that could interfere with aircraft systems. In fact, most commercial aircraft use GPS navigation themselves. Medical monitoring devices like the one Mrs. Santos is wearing are specifically designed to be safe for air travel, but the scanner detected electronic components." "Of course it did," Captain Hayes interrupted. "It's electronic medical equipment, just like pacemakers, insulin pumps, and hearing aids. We carry passengers with electronic medical devices on every single flight. The FAA has specific guidelines for medical equipment, and cardiac monitoring devices are not only permitted, they're encouraged for high-risk patients." Kevin felt his carefully constructed argument crumbling around him. Every expert who arrived provided more evidence that Maria's device was not only safe but necessary. Yet admitting error at this point would mean acknowledging that he'd put a heart patient through unnecessary trauma based on his own misunderstanding of security protocols. Dr. Robert Chen arrived at the airport 30 minutes after his initial phone call, having left his hospital rounds to personally address the situation. He carried with him Maria's complete medical file, manufacturer specifications for the GPS device, FAA approval documentation, and a determination to ensure that his patient received the respect and care she deserved. "Mrs. Santos," Dr. Chen said as he approached, "I came as soon as I heard what was happening. How are you feeling?" Maria's relief at seeing her doctor was palpable. "Dr. Chen, they want to take away the cross you modified. They don't believe it's medical equipment." Dr. Chen turned to address the assembled crowd of officials, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise and barely contained anger at how his patient had been treated. "I am Dr. Robert Chen, Chief of Cardiology at Presbyterian Hospital. Mrs. Santos is my patient, and the device she's wearing was installed at my recommendation following major cardiac surgery. This device monitors her heart rhythm continuously and automatically alerts emergency services if she experiences cardiac distress. Removing it would be equivalent to disconnecting a pacemaker, potentially fatal for someone with her condition." He pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "I have here the manufacturer's specifications, FAA approval certificates, installation records, and Mrs. Santos's complete medical history. The device is not only safe for air travel, it's essential for her survival." Kevin looked at the mountain of documentation and felt his position becoming increasingly untenable. But he'd spent so much time insisting that adequate verification was impossible that accepting Dr. Chen's evidence now would make him look incompetent. "How do I know these documents are authentic?" Kevin asked, though even he could hear the desperation in his own voice. Dr. Chen's response was swift and professional. "Call Presbyterian Hospital. Ask for the cardiology department. Verify my credentials. Call the device manufacturer. Verify the serial number. Call the FAA. Verify the approval documentation. I'll wait here while you make every call you need to make." Paramedic Wilson looked up from his monitoring equipment with growing concern. "Dr. Chen, Mrs. Santos's vitals are becoming increasingly unstable. Her heart rate is now sustained at over 150 beats per minute. We need to make a decision about transport soon." The medical urgency of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Maria stood in the center of the security checkpoint, surrounded by people arguing about her care, while her heart raced dangerously fast and her flight departure time approached. "Please," Maria said, her voice barely audible above the discussion swirling around her. "I just want to see my granddaughter. Can someone please just let me keep my mother's cross and get on the airplane?" The simple, heartbreaking request cut through all the technical discussions and protocol debates. Here was a grandmother whose only goal was to meet her first grandchild, being prevented from traveling because a security agent had decided that her life-saving medical equipment was a threat. Captain Hayes stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers. "Officer, as the pilot of Mrs. Santos's flight, I'm officially stating that her medical device poses no threat to aircraft safety. Dr. Chen has provided adequate documentation of its medical necessity. I'm prepared to accept full responsibility for allowing this passenger to board with her medical equipment." Rosa Martinez, who had been watching the situation spiral out of control, made a decision that would end Kevin's career, but might save Maria's life. "Kevin, step away from this situation. Mrs. Santos, you're free to proceed to your gate with your medical device. Dr. Chen, thank you for providing verification. Captain Hayes, thank you for clarifying the safety concerns." Kevin stared at his supervisor in disbelief. "Supervisor Martinez, we can't just ignore security protocols because a passenger has a sob story." "We're not ignoring protocols," Rosa replied firmly. "We're following them properly by accepting legitimate medical documentation and expert verification. What we're not doing is traumatizing a heart patient because of one officer's misunderstanding of medical device regulations." Kevin felt his world collapsing around him. 8 months of exemplary service, recommendations for promotion, pride in his professional judgment, all evaporating because he'd been too stubborn to admit when he was wrong. "This is a mistake," Kevin said, though his voice lacked conviction. "When something goes wrong, when this device causes problems on the aircraft, remember that I tried to prevent it." Dr. Chen looked at Kevin with something approaching pity. "Officer, the only problem here is that you've spent 40 minutes stressing a cardiac patient to the point where her monitoring device has been continuously alerting emergency services. The device you're so worried about is the only reason we knew she was in medical distress." Maria felt her legs wobbling as the stress and exhaustion of the confrontation finally caught up with her. Father O'Brien moved to support her, his steady presence an anchor of calm in the chaos that had surrounded her. "Mrs. Santos," Paramedic Wilson said gently, "your vitals are still elevated, but they're stabilizing now that the stressful situation is resolving. I'd still recommend a brief medical evaluation before you fly." "How long would that take?" Maria asked, glancing at the departure board that showed her flight was now boarding. 15 minutes, Dr. Chen interjected. "I can do a quick cardiac assessment here, verify that your heart rhythm is stable, and clear you for travel. Captain Hayes, would you be willing to hold the flight for a few minutes to ensure Mrs. Santos can travel safely?" Captain Hayes nodded immediately. "Absolutely. Mrs. Santos, take all the time you need to ensure you're medically cleared for travel. We'll wait for you." As Dr. Chen began his examination, using equipment Paramedic Wilson provided, Maria felt her heart rate finally beginning to slow. The nightmare was ending. She would see Isabella after all. Kevin stood at the edge of the group, watching his carefully ordered world fall apart. Everything he'd been taught about security protocols, everything he'd believed about his professional judgment, had been wrong. He'd traumatized an innocent woman, created a medical emergency, and demonstrated such poor judgment that his supervisor had been forced to publicly override his decisions. Within hours, video of the incident would be circulating on social media. A grandmother detained at airport security, surrounded by police and paramedics, all because she refused to surrender her mother's cross. The story would write itself: elderly heart patient, traumatized by overzealous airport security. Kevin's career in law enforcement was effectively over. But as Maria's heart rate returned to normal and Dr. Chen pronounced her stable for travel, something else was beginning. The story of how a community of strangers, a doctor, a priest, a pilot, a paramedic, and even a TSA supervisor had come together to protect a vulnerable woman when the system failed her. Father O'Brien walked with Maria toward her gate, carrying her small suitcase while she clutched her mother's cross with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Father. Thank you for coming when I needed help. That's what community means, Maria. When one of us is in trouble, all of us respond. You would have done the same for any of us." Captain Hayes met them at the gate, personally ensuring that Maria was comfortably seated and that the flight crew was aware of her medical condition. "Mrs. Santos, I want you to know that what happened today was not representative of how travelers should be treated. You've been through enough stress for one day." As the plane lifted off from Denver, Maria touched her mother's cross and said a prayer of gratitude, not just for the device that had monitored her heart through the crisis, but for the people who had understood that sometimes the system needs human beings to step in and do what's right. 3 hours into the flight, Maria felt her rebuilt heart settle into a steady rhythm as she gazed out the small airplane window at the desert landscape passing below. The cross around her neck felt warm against her skin, no longer a source of controversy but simply what it had always been, her mother's blessing and her own lifeline. She closed her eyes and let herself imagine Carmen's face when she walked through the arrival gate. Picture little Isabella's tiny fingers and the way newborns smelled like hope and possibility. But back at Denver International Airport, the aftermath of Maria's ordeal was just beginning to unfold in ways that would touch lives far beyond Terminal B. Kevin Walsh sat in the airport security office, staring at the incident report he was supposed to be writing, while his supervisor Rosa Martinez paced behind him like a caged tiger. The words wouldn't come because every sentence he tried to construct sounded like either an excuse or an admission of profound professional failure. "Kevin," Rosa said finally, her voice tight with controlled frustration, "I need to understand your thought process during this incident. Help me understand how a routine security screening became a medical emergency that required intervention from a cardiologist, airport chaplain, airline captain, and paramedic crew." Kevin's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. The same nervous energy that had driven his aggressive enforcement now turned inward in self-doubt. "I followed protocol exactly as I was trained. Passenger presented with unverified electronic device, claimed medical necessity, but couldn't provide adequate documentation. I escalated according to standard procedures." "Standard procedures," Rosa repeated slowly. "That resulted in a cardiac patient experiencing sustained tachycardia for over an hour. Standard procedures that required a doctor to leave his hospital rounds to personally verify medical equipment that any TSA supervisor could have cleared with a single phone call." The weight of what he'd done was beginning to penetrate Kevin's defensive shell. He'd been so focused on following rules that he'd forgotten the purpose behind those rules: protecting people, not traumatizing them. "I thought I was preventing a potential security breach." "Kevin, look at me." Rosa's voice softened slightly, shifting from supervisor to mentor. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen actual security threats, real dangerous devices, genuine attempts to circumvent our systems. What happened today wasn't a security issue. It was a failure of judgment, empathy, and basic human decency." The words hit Kevin like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of his professional confidence. He'd entered airport security believing he was protecting innocent travelers from dangerous people. Now he was confronting the possibility that he'd become the dangerous person innocent travelers needed protection from. "What happens now?" Kevin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Rosa pulled out a thick folder marked Internal Investigation and set it on the desk between them. "Full review of your actions, interviews with all witnesses, examination of security footage, and assessment of whether your behavior violated department policies regarding treatment of passengers with medical conditions." Kevin stared at the folder as if it contained his own death warrant. "And then?" "That depends on what the investigation reveals. But Kevin, I'll be honest with you. What I witnessed today raises serious questions about your suitability for this position. We don't just screen luggage and check identification. we interact with human beings who are often stressed, confused, or dealing with medical issues. If you can't distinguish between a genuine threat and a grandmother wearing her mother's cross, then maybe this isn't the right job for you. While Kevin contemplated the ruins of his career, word of Maria's treatment was spreading through social media with the viral intensity that modern injustices often achieve. A passenger named Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Kevin despite the shared surname, had recorded portions of the incident on her phone and posted the video with a caption that read, "Elderly heart patient traumatized by airport security for refusing to remove life-saving medical device. This is not who we are." The video showed Maria, small and fragile, surrounded by uniformed officials while she pleaded to keep her mother's cross. It captured her obvious distress, the medical equipment being attached by paramedics, and the moment when Dr. Chen arrived to provide verification that should never have been necessary. Within 6 hours, the video had been shared 8,000 times, generating thousands of comments ranging from outrage to support for better training of security personnel. Mrs. Chen, the florist who had called Tommy Rodriguez in the original incident that had inspired this story, saw the video on her daughter's Facebook page and immediately recognized the injustice. She shared it with her own network, adding a comment that resonated with viewers. "This could be any of our mothers or grandmothers. When did we become so afraid that we forgot how to show compassion?" Father O'Brien watched the video from his airport chapel office and felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. Not the hot rage of immediate injustice, but the cold determination of someone who'd spent decades fighting systemic problems that hurt vulnerable people. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Williams, the airport's director of operations. "Patricia, it's Father O'Brien. I need to discuss what happened at Security Checkpoint 12 today. We have a serious problem with how passengers with medical conditions are being treated, and it needs to be addressed before someone gets seriously hurt." Patricia Williams had already received 3 phone calls about the incident. One from Dr. Chen demanding policy changes, another from Captain Hayes recommending additional training for security staff, and a third from the airline's corporate office asking why their passenger had been traumatized for wearing medical equipment. "Father, I'm aware of the situation. We're conducting a full investigation and reviewing our policies regarding medical devices." "Patricia, this isn't about policies. It's about basic human decency. That young man treated a heart patient like a terrorist suspect because he was more concerned with following rules than understanding their purpose. Training can fix ignorance, but I'm not sure it can fix a fundamental lack of empathy." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Father O'Brien describing Maria's obvious distress and the way multiple professionals had to intervene to correct a situation that should never have escalated beyond a simple verification phone call. By the end of the call, Patricia Williams had committed to mandatory retraining for all security personnel and establishment of a medical liaison position to handle complex cases involving passengers with health conditions. Dr. Chen spent the rest of his day fielding calls from colleagues who'd seen the video and wanted to understand how a cardiac monitoring device could be mistaken for a security threat. Each conversation reinforced his growing conviction that medical professionals needed to take a more active role in educating security personnel about the life-saving devices their patients depended on. "The problem," Dr. Chen explained to Dr. Sarah Martinez, Chief of Emergency Medicine, "is that these devices are becoming more sophisticated and more common, but security training hasn't kept pace. We're going to see more incidents like this unless we build better bridges between the medical community and airport security." Dr. Martinez had been thinking along similar lines since receiving the emergency alert about Maria's cardiac distress. What if we established a medical advisory board for the airport? Doctors who could provide immediate consultation on medical device questions and help develop better screening protocols for patients with complex health conditions? The idea gained momentum as they discussed it. A network of medical professionals available 24 hours a day to verify medical devices, explain their necessity, and ensure that patients weren't subjected to unnecessary stress. It would prevent situations like Maria's while maintaining legitimate security concerns. "I'll call Patricia Williams and propose the idea," Dr. Chen decided. "After today's incident, I think she'll be very receptive to anything that prevents similar problems." Meanwhile, Captain Hayes was having her own conversation with airline management about the incident. As someone responsible for passenger safety, she was deeply troubled by the way Maria had been treated, and the potential for similar incidents to occur with other passengers. "The issue," Captain Hayes explained to Regional Director Michael Thompson, is that our passengers increasingly rely on sophisticated medical devices that security personnel aren't trained to recognize or handle appropriately. Today it was a cardiac monitoring system, but we also carry passengers with insulin pumps, neurological stimulators, and other life-sustaining equipment that could be misidentified as security threats. Director Thompson had been reviewing the incident reports and social media coverage, calculating the potential damage to the airline's reputation if passengers began to fear that traveling with medical conditions would subject them to harassment and humiliation. What are you recommending, Captain? Better coordination between airlines and airport security regarding passengers with medical needs. Pre-flight notification systems for passengers carrying medical devices. Maybe even a medical travel coordinator position to help passengers navigate security screening with complex health conditions. The conversation represented a shift in thinking from viewing passengers with medical devices as potential security problems to recognizing them as customers who deserved accommodation and respect. Captain Hayes had seen enough medical emergencies at altitude to understand how crucial these devices were for passenger safety. "I'll take this up with the airport authority," Director Thompson promised. "We can't have passengers afraid to travel because they might be traumatized for wearing life-saving equipment." As evening approached at Denver International, Rosa Martinez completed her preliminary incident report and forwarded it to Internal Affairs with a recommendation for immediate suspension pending full investigation. Kevin Walsh's 8-month career in airport security was effectively over, but the ripple effects of his actions were just beginning to spread through the system. The video of Maria's treatment had been picked up by local news stations, then national networks, and finally international media outlets hungry for stories about airport security overreach. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the incident: the vulnerability of elderly passengers, the importance of medical devices, the need for better training, or the power of community intervention when systems fail. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary people who saw themselves or their loved ones in Maria's situation. Comments poured in from passengers who'd experienced similar difficulties with medical equipment, family members who worried about their relatives traveling with health conditions, and healthcare workers who understood the critical importance of continuous monitoring devices. Margaret Foster, a retired nurse from Colorado Springs, wrote, "I watched this video with tears in my eyes, thinking about my own mother who wore a similar device after her heart surgery. The idea that she could have been traumatized like this for trying to stay alive breaks my heart." James Rodriguez, a veteran who relied on multiple medical devices, commented, "This is exactly why many of us are afraid to travel. We're treated like criminals for wearing equipment that keeps us alive. Something needs to change." The comments reflected a broader frustration with security systems that seemed to prioritize procedure over people, compliance over compassion. Maria's story had become a symbol of everything wrong with bureaucratic inflexibility and everything right with human intervention when institutions fail. Dr. Patricia Williams, the airport director, spent her evening reviewing security protocols and incident reports, looking for patterns that might indicate systemic problems rather than isolated incidents. What she found was troubling: multiple complaints over the past year from passengers with medical devices, several instances of unnecessary delays for travelers with health conditions, and a pattern of security personnel defaulting to suspicion rather than verification when encountering unfamiliar medical equipment. "We have a training problem," she concluded in her late-night email to the Airport Authority Board, "and we have a culture problem. Our security staff are operating under the assumption that any deviation from normal is a potential threat, rather than understanding that medical diversity is normal and accommodation is part of their job." She outlined a comprehensive reform program, including mandatory sensitivity training, establishment of a medical advisory board, creation of a passenger advocate position, and revision of screening protocols to better accommodate travelers with health conditions. The reforms would cost money and require time to implement, but the alternative was continued incidents that damaged both individual passengers and the airport's reputation. Tommy Rodriguez, the Marine veteran who had organized the response to Roland Kemper's situation in the story that inspired this narrative, saw Maria's video through his network of veteran advocates and immediately recognized the familiar pattern of authority being used to harm rather than protect vulnerable people. He shared the video with his fellow Marines, adding his own commentary. "Different uniform, same problem. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us forget that their job is to serve, not to dominate." This grandmother deserved better. The veteran community's response was swift and supportive, with multiple organizations reaching out to offer assistance to Maria and advocacy for better treatment of travelers with medical conditions. Their involvement brought additional attention to the story and reinforced the theme of community protection when institutions fail. Marcus Williams, one of the Marines who had stood with Roland Kemper, now worked as a trainer for security companies and immediately recognized the training deficiencies that had led to Maria's traumatic experience. The problem, Marcus explained to his colleagues, is that security training focuses almost exclusively on identifying threats while providing minimal instruction on recognizing legitimate medical needs. These officers are taught to be suspicious of everything unusual without being given the tools to distinguish between actual dangers and life-saving equipment. He began developing a training module specifically focused on medical device recognition and appropriate accommodation procedures, drawing on input from healthcare professionals and patient advocacy groups. The module would eventually be adopted by multiple airports and security companies, turning Maria's negative experience into positive change for future travelers. As Maria's plane descended toward Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, she felt her heart rate increase with excitement rather than stress for the first time that day. The ordeal at Denver had been traumatic, but it had also revealed something important about human nature. When confronted with injustice, good people stepped forward to make things right. Dr. Chen had called ahead to ensure that Phoenix medical staff were aware of her condition and the day's events. Captain Hayes had personally checked on her during the flight and arranged for priority disembarking. Father O'Brien had given her his card and asked her to call when she was safely with her family. Even paramedic Wilson had wished her well and reminded her to seek medical attention if she experienced any further cardiac symptoms. Carmen was waiting at the gate with tears in her eyes and little Isabella sleeping peacefully in her car seat. "Mom, I saw the video online. I can't believe what they put you through." Maria hugged her daughter carefully, mindful of the new mother's recovery and the precious cargo she carried. "It was frightening, sweetheart, but it showed me something wonderful too. When that young man tried to take away my mother's cross, strangers became family and stood up for what was right." She looked down at Isabella, whose tiny face was perfect in the way that only newborns can be, and felt her heart swell with emotion that had nothing to do with medical conditions and everything to do with love, multiplied across generations. "Your great-grandmother's cross brought me to you safely," Maria whispered to the sleeping baby, "and it brought us some guardian angels along the way." The technology inside the cross continued its quiet vigilance, monitoring heartbeats and location, ready to summon help if needed. But for now, Maria's heart was steady and strong, sustained by the joy of new life and the knowledge that even in a world that sometimes seemed hostile to vulnerability, there were still people willing to stand between the powerful and the powerless. Carmen helped her mother into the car, carefully securing Isabella's car seat, while Maria marveled at how something so small could inspire such fierce protection. As they drove through the Phoenix evening toward Carmen's home, Maria thought about the day's events and the people who had helped her when the system failed. She would write thank you letters to all of them, she decided. Dr. Chen, Father O'Brien, Captain Hayes, Paramedic Wilson, even Rosa Martinez, who had finally done the right thing. They deserved to know that their kindness had mattered, that their intervention had not only saved her trip but restored her faith in human decency. The cross around her neck caught the streetlight as they drove, its silver surface reflecting the warm glow of a city welcoming a grandmother to meet her first grandchild. Inside the ancient metal, modern technology continued its silent watch, but Maria knew now that the most sophisticated monitoring system couldn't compare to the network of caring people who had surrounded her when she needed protection most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Kevin Walsh would face the consequences of his actions, airport officials would implement policy changes, and medical professionals would work to prevent similar incidents. But tonight, Maria Santos held her granddaughter for the first time and felt her heart beat steady and strong with the rhythm of love that connected generations and sustained communities. The GPS device had done its job, alerting emergency services when she was in distress. But it was the human emergency services, the doctor who left his rounds, the priest who abandoned his duties, the pilot who delayed her flight, and the paramedic who treated her with dignity, who had truly saved the day. In the end, that's what the cross had always represented. Not just faith in divine protection, but trust in the capacity of human beings to care for one another when institutions fail and systems break down. Maria's mother had worn it through decades of challenges, and now it would protect Maria through whatever came next. carrying within its blessed silver both advanced technology and ancient wisdom about the power of community to overcome individual cruelty. As Isabella stirred in her arms, Maria whispered the same prayer her mother had taught her decades ago, a prayer for protection and guidance that now seemed to encompass not just family, but all the strangers who had become guardians when she needed them most. The cross warmed against her chest, and Maria knew that some blessings multiply when shared, growing stronger rather than weaker when extended to others who need hope, help, and human kindness in a complicated world. 2 weeks later, Maria stood in Carmen's kitchen feeding Isabella while watching the morning news, when a familiar face appeared on the television screen. Kevin Walsh sat across from a local reporter, his shoulders hunched and his eyes avoiding the camera, as he attempted to explain his actions on that October morning at Denver International Airport. "I want to apologize to Mrs. Santos and her family," Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a serious error in judgment that caused unnecessary trauma to someone who was simply trying to travel to see her granddaughter. There's no excuse for how I handled that situation." Maria adjusted Isabella against her shoulder, feeling the baby's tiny heartbeat against her chest while her own heart maintained its steady rhythm under the watchful protection of her mother's cross. She'd expected to feel anger watching Kevin's public confession, but instead she found herself feeling something closer to pity. The young man on screen looked broken, diminished by the weight of his mistakes and the public scrutiny that had followed. "Turn it off, Mom," Carmen said gently, reaching for the remote. "You don't need to relive that day," but Maria shook her head, watching as Kevin struggled to answer the reporter's questions about his training, his judgment, and his future plans. "No, leave it on. I want to hear what he has to say." The reporter pressed Kevin about the incident, asking why he'd refused to accept medical documentation and expert verification. Kevin's answers were halting, filled with admissions of error and expressions of regret that seemed genuine but couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. "I was following protocol as I understood it," Kevin explained, "but I realize now that protocol should never override common sense and human compassion. I lost sight of the fact that my job is to help people travel safely, not to traumatize them for wearing life-saving medical equipment." The interview revealed that Kevin had been terminated from his position with the Transportation Security Administration and was currently unemployed. He'd applied for jobs in other fields, but the viral video of his encounter with Maria had made him recognizable and, in many cases, unemployable. The young man who'd been so certain of his authority 2 weeks earlier now faced an uncertain future shaped by a single moment of poor judgment. "What would you say to Mrs. Santos if you could speak to her directly?" the reporter asked. Kevin looked directly into the camera for the first time during the interview, his eyes reflecting genuine remorse. "Mrs. Santos, I'm deeply sorry for what I put you through. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, especially given your medical condition and the emotional significance of your trip. I failed you completely, and I understand if you can never forgive me. I just hope that my mistakes can serve as a lesson for others about the importance of treating every passenger as a human being deserving of compassion." Maria felt tears welling in her eyes, though she wasn't entirely sure whether they were tears of sadness, forgiveness, or something more complex. The man apologizing on television bore little resemblance to the confident, inflexible officer who'd traumatized her at the airport. This Kevin Walsh looked haunted by his actions, genuinely remorseful in a way that suggested real understanding of the harm he'd caused. "Mom, are you okay?" Carmen asked, noticing her mother's emotional response. "I think I need to write him a letter," Maria said quietly, still watching as Kevin concluded his interview with another apology and a plea for airport security personnel to receive better training in dealing with medical conditions. Carmen looked at her mother with concern. "Mom, you don't owe him anything. He put you through hell for no reason." "I know, sweetheart. But seeing him like this, knowing that his life has been destroyed by his mistake, I keep thinking about what your grandmother would have done. She always believed in forgiveness, especially for people who were genuinely sorry for their actions." The news segment shifted to an update on the policy changes being implemented at Denver International Airport in response to Maria's treatment. Dr. Patricia Williams, the airport director, stood at a podium announcing the creation of a medical device advisory board, enhanced training for security personnel, and the establishment of a passenger advocate position specifically to assist travelers with health conditions. "The incident involving Mrs. Santos revealed significant gaps in our training and procedures," Dr. Williams explained. We've implemented comprehensive reforms to ensure that passengers with medical conditions are treated with the dignity and accommodation they deserve. The report showed security personnel participating in new training sessions led by medical professionals, learning to recognize various types of life-saving devices and understand the proper procedures for verification and accommodation. The training emphasized that medical equipment should be treated as essential to passenger safety rather than potential security threats. Dr. Chen appeared in the news segment, describing the medical device advisory board he now chaired. We have medical professionals available 24 hours a day to provide immediate consultation on any questions about medical equipment. No passenger should ever have to endure what Mrs. Santos experienced because security personnel couldn't verify the legitimacy of their life-saving devices. Father O'Brien was also interviewed, speaking about the broader lessons of the incident. This situation reminded us that security and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. We can protect people while still treating them with dignity, especially when they're vulnerable due to age or medical conditions. Captain Hayes concluded the news segment by describing new airline policies for passengers traveling with medical devices. We're implementing pre-flight notification systems so passengers can inform us in advance about medical equipment they'll be carrying. This allows us to coordinate with security and ensure smooth screening processes that don't compromise either safety or passenger dignity. The comprehensive response to Maria's treatment demonstrated how one incident of injustice had catalyzed systemic change across multiple institutions. Her traumatic experience had become the catalyst for reforms that would protect countless future travelers from similar treatment. Later that afternoon, Maria sat at Carmen's kitchen table writing the letter she'd decided to send to Kevin Walsh. Isabella slept peacefully in her bassinet nearby, occasionally making the soft sounds that newborns produce when dreaming. The cross around Maria's neck caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, its silver surface warm against her skin. "Dear Mr. Walsh," she began, then paused to consider her words carefully. This letter would be difficult to write, requiring her to balance her own trauma with compassion for someone whose life had been derailed by his actions. "I saw your interview on the morning news today, and I wanted to respond to your apology. What happened at the airport that day was frightening and humiliating for me, and it nearly prevented me from meeting my granddaughter Isabella, who is sleeping beside me as I write this letter." Maria paused, looking at Isabella's peaceful face and feeling her heart fill with the love that had motivated her difficult journey. "However, I also recognize that you are a young man who made a serious mistake, not a monster who intended to cause harm. Your apology seemed genuine, and I believe you truly understand the impact of your actions." She continued writing, describing the trauma of being treated as a security threat for wearing her mother's cross, but also acknowledging the lesson the incident had taught about the importance of human intervention when systems fail people who need protection. "I want you to know that I forgive you, Mr. Walsh, not because your actions weren't harmful, but because forgiveness is what my mother taught me and what her cross reminds me to practice. I hope you can learn from this experience and find ways to help others in the future, perhaps by sharing your story so that other security personnel understand the human cost of inflexibility and poor judgment." The letter continued for several pages, offering forgiveness while maintaining accountability, expressing hope for Kevin's future while acknowledging the real harm his actions had caused. It was a complex document that reflected Maria's own complex feelings about the incident and its aftermath. When she finished writing, Maria folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope addressed to Kevin through the television station that had interviewed him. She wasn't sure he would receive it, but writing it had helped her process her own emotions about the incident and its resolution. "Are you really going to send that?" Carmen asked, reading over her mother's shoulder. "Yes, I think I am. Your grandmother always said that forgiveness isn't about excusing harmful behavior. It's about refusing to let that behavior define your own response to the world. I don't want to carry anger about this incident when I have so much joy to focus on." Maria looked at Isabella, who had awakened and was gazing at her grandmother with the unfocused but intent attention that newborns give to new faces. "I want Isabella to grow up in a world where people can make mistakes, take responsibility for them, and be given the chance to do better. That starts with how I respond to the people who have hurt me." 3 days later, Kevin Walsh received Maria's letter at his apartment in Denver. He'd been spending his unemployed days applying for jobs and attending therapy sessions to process the guilt and public shame that had consumed his life since the airport incident. The letter arrived on a particularly difficult day when he'd received another rejection email from a potential employer who cited the viral video as a reason for declining his application. Kevin opened the envelope with trembling hands, expecting either a legal document or an angry condemnation of his actions. Instead, he found Maria's careful handwriting offering something he hadn't dared to hope for: forgiveness coupled with accountability, compassion balanced with honesty about the harm he'd caused. He read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated his consciousness. Maria Santos, the woman he'd traumatized for wearing her mother's cross, was offering him forgiveness while challenging him to become a better person. The letter didn't excuse his behavior or minimize its impact, but it offered him a path forward that didn't require carrying the burden of unforgivable guilt for the rest of his life. Kevin immediately sat down to write a response, though he struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude for Maria's grace and his commitment to earning the forgiveness she'd offered. His letter was shorter than hers but equally heartfelt, thanking her for her compassion and promising to spend his life trying to make amends for his actions. "Mrs. Santos," he wrote, "your letter means more to me than I can express. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it, and I promise to honor it by becoming the kind of person who would never repeat the mistakes I made that day. Thank you for showing me that redemption is possible even after serious failures." The correspondence between Maria and Kevin would continue for months, evolving into an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing similar incidents from harming other travelers. Kevin would eventually find work with a non-profit organization focused on improving accessibility in transportation, using his experience and regret to advocate for better treatment of passengers with disabilities and medical conditions. Meanwhile, the systemic changes triggered by Maria's experience were beginning to show measurable results. The Medical Device Advisory Board that Dr. Chin chaired had handled over 40 consultations in its first 2 weeks of operation, helping security personnel properly accommodate passengers with various types of medical equipment without compromising safety protocols. The enhanced training program developed by airport security in consultation with medical professionals had been adopted by 3 other major airports, with requests for implementation coming from transportation hubs across the country. Marcus Williams, the Marine veteran who had developed the medical device recognition module, found himself traveling nationwide to train security personnel in the balance between vigilance and compassion. "The key lesson," Marcus explained to a group of TSA supervisors in Chicago, "is that security and accommodation aren't opposing goals. When we properly understand and accommodate legitimate medical needs, we actually enhance security by focusing our attention on real threats rather than life-saving devices." The training sessions included real-world scenarios, consultation with medical professionals, and emphasis on the human impact of security decisions. Trainees learned to recognize various types of medical devices, understand verification procedures, and prioritize passenger dignity while maintaining safety standards. Father O'Brien had established interfaith chaplain services at 4 additional airports, providing spiritual support and advocacy for passengers experiencing difficulties with security screening or other travel challenges. His office had become a resource for travelers who felt their religious or cultural practices were being misunderstood or disrespected by airport personnel. Maria's story reminded us that airports are more than transit points, Father O'Brien explained to a conference of airport chaplains. They're places where people experience significant stress, joy, grief, and hope. Our job is to ensure that the human element doesn't get lost in the machinery of modern travel. Captain Hayes had worked with her airline to develop industry-leading policies for passengers with medical conditions, including pre-flight medical device registration, expedited security screening for verified medical equipment, and crew training for managing in-flight medical emergencies involving technological devices. Airlines have a responsibility to their passengers that goes beyond simply transporting them from point A to point B, Captain Hayes explained to a gathering of airline executives. "We're responsible for their dignity, their safety, and their confidence that traveling with medical conditions won't subject them to discrimination or trauma." The policy changes had attracted positive attention from disability rights organizations, medical associations, and passenger advocacy groups. Airlines implementing similar policies reported increased customer satisfaction and reduced incidents involving passengers with medical conditions. Dr. Chen had expanded his advocacy beyond the airport setting, working with medical device manufacturers to improve identification and documentation systems that would make security screenings smoother for patients. He'd also established a network of medical professionals willing to provide emergency consultation for transportation security agencies dealing with unfamiliar medical equipment. The technology that keeps our patients alive is becoming more sophisticated and more common, Dr. Chen explained to a medical conference. As healthcare providers, we have a responsibility to ensure that our patients can travel safely without being treated as security threats for wearing the devices we've prescribed. The medical community's response to Maria's experience had led to improved documentation standards, better patient education about traveling with medical devices, and enhanced communication between healthcare providers and transportation security agencies. Rosa Martinez, the TSA supervisor who had ultimately resolved Maria's situation, had been promoted to a regional training position where she developed protocols for handling complex passenger situations that required balancing security concerns with human needs. Her experience with Maria's case had taught her that good supervision sometimes meant overruling subordinates who confused inflexibility with professionalism. Leadership in security means knowing when to enforce rules and when to enforce values, Rosa explained to a group of new supervisors. Sometimes the most secure environment is one where passengers trust us to treat them fairly and with dignity. The training programs Rosa developed emphasized de-escalation techniques, recognition of vulnerable populations, and the importance of seeking supervisory guidance when dealing with unusual situations. The programs had significantly reduced passenger complaints and improved employee satisfaction among security personnel who felt better equipped to handle complex situations. As news of the comprehensive reforms spread through social media and news outlets, Maria began receiving letters and emails from travelers who had experienced similar difficulties and felt validated by the changes being implemented in response to her story. Many shared their own experiences of being misunderstood or mistreated because of medical conditions or assistive devices. Eleanor Patterson, a diabetic from Oregon, wrote, "Thank you for speaking out about your experience. I've been afraid to travel with my insulin pump because of stories like yours, but knowing that policies are changing gives me hope that I can visit my family without fear of discrimination." Robert Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, shared his experience as a veteran with a prosthetic leg who had endured repeated invasive searches and questioning about his medical equipment. "Your story and the changes it's bringing give me confidence that other veterans with disabilities won't have to endure what I've experienced." The letters reinforced Maria's conviction that her traumatic experience had served a larger purpose, protecting vulnerable travelers from similar treatment and encouraging systemic changes that prioritized human dignity alongside security concerns. 1 month after the airport incident, Maria returned to Denver for a follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen. She'd initially dreaded the trip, fearful that passing through the same airport would trigger traumatic memories and anxiety. But Carmen had encouraged her to face her fears, and Dr. Chen had arranged for special assistance to ensure smooth passage through security. When Maria arrived at Security Checkpoint 12, she was greeted by Rosa Martinez, who personally escorted her through the enhanced screening process that had been developed for passengers with medical devices. The new procedures were efficient and respectful, requiring only brief documentation review and a quick consultation with the on-duty medical advisor. "Mrs. Santos," Rosa said as they completed the screening process, "I want you to know that your experience has changed everything about how we handle passengers with medical conditions. The training and policies we've implemented because of your situation have already helped dozens of other travelers avoid similar trauma." Maria touched her mother's cross, feeling its familiar weight and warmth against her chest. "I'm glad something positive came from what happened. No one should have to choose between their health and their dignity when they travel." The return trip through Denver International Airport demonstrated how quickly and comprehensively institutions could change when motivated by genuine commitment to improvement. Maria's traumatic experience had been transformed into systemic reform that would protect countless future travelers from similar treatment. As her flight lifted off from Denver, Maria looked down at the city that had been the site of her worst and, in some ways, best moments as a traveler. The worst because of the trauma and humiliation she'd endured, but also the best because of the community of strangers who had intervened to protect her when the system failed. Her mother's cross caught the airplane window's light, its silver surface reflecting the Colorado landscape passing below. Inside the ancient metal, modern technology continued its quiet vigilance, monitoring her heart and ready to summon help if needed. But Maria knew now, that the most sophisticated technology couldn't compare to the network of caring people who had surrounded her when she needed protection most. The GPS device would continue to guard her health, but it was the human connections forged in crisis that would sustain her spirit through whatever challenges lay ahead. In the end, that's what the cross had always represented. Not just faith in divine protection, but trust in the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when confronted with injustice and given the opportunity to choose compassion over convenience, dignity over protocol, and community over bureaucracy. 6 months after that October morning at Denver International Airport, Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at the annual Transportation Security Administration Training Conference, her mother's silver cross catching the stage lights as she prepared to address an audience of security supervisors, airport administrators, and policymakers from across the nation. The invitation to speak had come from Dr. Patricia Williams, who believed that hearing directly from someone who had experienced security trauma might have more impact than any policy manual or training video. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she approached the microphone, not from fear or anxiety, but from the weight of responsibility she felt to represent not just her own experience, but the experiences of countless travelers who had faced similar challenges with medical devices, disabilities, or health conditions that made them vulnerable to misunderstanding and mistreatment by well-intentioned but poorly trained security personnel. "My name is Maria Santos," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "and 6 months ago, I was a 65-year-old grandmother excited to meet my first grandchild. I was also a heart patient wearing a GPS monitoring device that could save my life if my rebuilt cardiovascular system failed during travel. What happened to me at one of your airports nearly prevented me from making the most important trip of my life, and it taught me something profound about the difference between security that protects and security that traumatizes." The audience, many of whom had seen the viral video of Maria's airport ordeal, listened with the respectful attention accorded to someone whose personal experience had already changed their professional practices. But Maria's speech would go beyond simply recounting her traumatic experience to explore the broader implications of how institutions treat vulnerable populations when fear overshadows compassion. When Officer Kevin Walsh approached me at Security Checkpoint 12 that morning, he saw a potential threat to be neutralized rather than a person to be helped. My mother's cross, which had been blessed at my childhood church and modified to contain life-saving medical technology, became in his eyes a suspicious device requiring confiscation. My medical documentation became fake papers requiring verification. My requests for accommodation became non-compliance requiring police intervention. Maria paused, looking out at the faces in the audience and seeing recognition in many of them. These were people who had dedicated their careers to protecting travelers, but who had also seen how good intentions could be corrupted by poor training, institutional pressure, and the kind of fear that made every deviation from normal seem like a potential catastrophe. I don't tell you this to embarrass Officer Walsh, who has since apologized sincerely and dedicated his life to ensuring that other travelers never experience what I experienced. I tell you this because my story represents a failure of imagination, training, and empathy that can be corrected if we commit ourselves to seeing passengers as human beings first and potential security threats only when evidence supports that assessment. The speech continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Maria describing not just her own experience, but the broader lessons it revealed about institutional culture, training deficiencies, and the importance of building systems that accommodate human diversity rather than punishing it. She spoke about the medical professionals who had intervened on her behalf, the airline captain who had delayed her flight, the airport chaplain who had provided support, and the TSA supervisor who had ultimately chosen to prioritize her well-being over rigid adherence to misunderstood protocols. The heroes of my story weren't the people who followed rules blindly, Maria explained, but the people who understood that rules exist to serve human needs, not the other way around. Dr. Chen left his hospital rounds to verify my medical device because he understood that a patient's dignity and safety mattered more than his convenience. Captain Hayes held my flight because she recognized that accommodation and security worked together, not against each other. Father O'Brien came to support me because he understood that spiritual care includes advocating for justice when institutions fail vulnerable people. The audience response was profound and immediate. Many security supervisors approached Maria after her speech to share their own experiences with difficult passenger situations and their commitment to implementing the kind of training and cultural changes her story had inspired. Airport administrators discussed plans to expand medical device advisory programs and passenger advocacy services based on the successful models developed in response to her experience. But the most meaningful response came from passengers themselves, who had heard about Maria's speech through social media and news coverage, and reached out to share their own experiences of traveling with medical conditions, disabilities, or other circumstances that made them vulnerable to misunderstanding by security personnel. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Kevin Walsh but a woman who shared his surname and had recorded the original video of Maria's airport ordeal, had become an unexpected advocate for travelers with medical devices after witnessing firsthand how quickly a routine security screening could become a traumatic confrontation. She had used her social media platform to share stories from other passengers who had faced similar challenges and to highlight the positive changes being implemented at airports across the country. Maria's courage in speaking publicly about her experience has created a ripple effect that extends far beyond airport security. Jennifer explained in a blog post that accompanied video clips from Maria's TSA conference speech. She's shown us that individual trauma can become collective healing when people are willing to transform their pain into advocacy for systemic change. The blog post included testimonials from dozens of travelers who had benefited from the policy changes and training programs implemented in response to Maria's experience. Diabetics traveling with insulin pumps reported smoother security screenings and better understanding from TSA personnel. Veterans with prosthetic limbs described more respectful treatment and streamlined accommodation procedures. Elderly passengers with various medical devices expressed increased confidence about traveling without fear of harassment or humiliation. Dr. Chen had expanded his medical device advisory work beyond Denver International Airport to include consultation with airports across the country seeking to implement similar programs. His network of medical professionals willing to provide individual needs. Her experience with Maria's case had taught her that effective security leadership required understanding when to enforce rules and when to enforce values. Security isn't just about preventing bad things from happening, Rosa explained to a group of newly promoted TSA supervisors. It's about creating environments where people feel protected rather than threatened by the systems designed to keep them safe. When passengers trust us to treat them fairly, they're more likely to cooperate with legitimate security requirements and report genuine concerns. Rosa's leadership had led to implementation of passenger advocacy programs at airports across the country, enhanced training for security personnel dealing with vulnerable populations, and development of de-escalation techniques that prioritized problem-solving over punishment when passengers presented complex situations requiring accommodation. The training programs she had developed emphasized the importance of recognizing that unusual circumstances weren't necessarily suspicious circumstances, that medical diversity was normal rather than exceptional, and that good security practice included protecting passengers from trauma inflicted by poorly trained or overzealous personnel. Marcus Williams, the Marine veteran who had developed medical device recognition training modules, had established a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving accessibility in transportation systems for veterans and civilians with disabilities or medical conditions. His organization provided consulting services to airports, airlines, and other transportation agencies seeking to develop more inclusive policies and practices. Military service teaches you that mission success depends on taking care of your people, Marcus explained to a gathering of veteran service organizations. And in civilian transportation, passengers are our people. We succeed when they feel safe, respected, and confident that their medical needs will be accommodated rather than punished. The nonprofit had documented significant improvements in passenger satisfaction and reduced complaints related to disability discrimination at transportation facilities that had implemented their recommended training and policy changes. The organization had also provided advocacy services for individual travelers who encountered difficulties with security screening or other accessibility challenges. Kevin Walsh had found his calling working with Marcus Williams's organization, using his experience and regret to train security personnel about the human impact of inflexibility and poor judgment. His presentations to TSA training classes were powerful reminders that good intentions weren't sufficient protection against causing serious harm when those intentions weren't guided by adequate training, cultural sensitivity, and genuine respect for passenger dignity. I thought I was protecting people, Kevin would tell training classes, but I was actually traumatizing someone who needed protection from me. Mrs. Santos taught me that security work is fundamentally about service, not control, and that serving people well requires understanding their individual needs, rather than treating everyone as potential threats. Kevin's work with the nonprofit had helped him rebuild his life around a commitment to preventing other security personnel from making the mistakes that had destroyed his original career and traumatized an innocent woman. His presentations were difficult to watch but impossible to ignore, providing visceral understanding of how quickly good intentions could become harmful actions when training was inadequate and empathy was absent. The correspondence between Kevin and Maria had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to improving transportation security for vulnerable populations. Their unlikely partnership had become a powerful symbol of how personal redemption could contribute to systemic reform when people were willing to transform their mistakes into opportunities for growth and service. Maria's granddaughter Isabella had grown from a newborn into a curious 6-month-old who seemed to recognize her grandmother's voice during their frequent video calls between Phoenix and Denver. Maria had made 3 more trips to visit Isabella, each one demonstrating how dramatically airport security procedures had improved for passengers with medical conditions. The streamlined screening process now included immediate recognition of Maria's medical device documentation, courteous treatment from security personnel who had been trained to understand the importance of cardiac monitoring equipment, and access to medical consultation if any questions arose about her device or condition. The contrast with her original traumatic experience was stark and encouraging. "Every time I travel now," Maria told Carmen during one of their phone conversations, "I think about other passengers who are benefiting from the changes that came from my terrible day at the airport. It doesn't make what happened to me acceptable, but it makes it meaningful." Carmen had been documenting her mother's advocacy work and the systemic changes it had inspired, creating a comprehensive record of how individual trauma could be transformed into collective healing when people were willing to speak truth about institutional failures and work toward constructive solutions. Mom's story shows that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they're willing to turn their pain into purpose, Carmen explained to a local newspaper reporter who was writing about the continuing impact of Maria's airport experience. She could have remained angry and bitter about what happened to her, but instead she chose to use her experience to help other people avoid similar trauma. The newspaper article was part of broader media coverage examining the long-term effects of Maria's airport ordeal on transportation security policies and practices. Investigative reporters had documented measurable improvements in passenger satisfaction scores, reduced complaints related to medical device screening, and enhanced training programs at airports across the country that had implemented reforms inspired by Maria's experience. Academic researchers had also begun studying Maria's case as an example of how individual advocacy could catalyze institutional change when supported by media attention, expert validation, and sustained pressure for reform. Several universities had developed case studies based on her experience for use in courses on public administration, civil rights, and organizational change management. The research confirmed what advocates had long argued, that institutional cultures could change rapidly when motivated by genuine commitment to improvement, adequate resources for training and policy development, and leadership that prioritized human dignity alongside operational efficiency. Maria's experience had provided a real-world laboratory for testing theories about how vulnerable populations could be better served by large bureaucratic organizations. Dr. Patricia Williams, the airport director who had implemented the initial reforms in response to Maria's treatment, had been invited to speak at transportation conferences around the world about the lessons learned from the incident and the comprehensive changes it had inspired. Her presentations emphasized that effective reform required not just policy changes, but cultural transformation that prioritized passenger welfare alongside security concerns. Maria Santos didn't just experience bad customer service, Dr. Williams would explain to conference audiences. She experienced institutional failure that reflected deeper problems with how we train personnel, design policies, and think about our responsibility to the people we serve. Fixing those problems required more than apologizing to one passenger. It required examining our entire approach to balancing security with human dignity. The reforms implemented at Denver International Airport had become a model for transportation facilities worldwide, with delegations from airports in Europe, Asia, and Australia visiting to study the programs and policies developed in response to Maria's experience. The international attention had reinforced the global significance of the issues her case had highlighted, and the universal applicability of the solutions that had been developed. International transportation organizations had begun developing standardized protocols for accommodating passengers with medical devices and disabilities, drawing heavily on the successful models pioneered at airports that had reformed their practices following Maria's traumatic experience. The protocols emphasized that accommodation and security were complementary rather than competing priorities. 1 year after her initial airport ordeal, Maria received an invitation to serve on a federal advisory committee examining transportation accessibility for passengers with disabilities and medical conditions. The committee's work would inform policy development at the national level, ensuring that the lessons learned from her experience would influence transportation security practices throughout the United States. "When I put on my mother's cross that October morning," Maria reflected in her acceptance letter for the advisory committee position, "I never imagined that it would lead to a year of advocacy work and policy reform. But I've learned that sometimes our worst experiences can become our most important contributions if we're willing to transform our pain into purpose and our trauma into tools for helping others." The advisory committee work would be demanding, requiring travel to Washington, D.C. for monthly meetings and extensive review of proposed regulations and policy changes. But Maria felt called to continue the work that had grown from her personal experience, knowing that her voice could help ensure that future transportation policies reflected the needs and dignity of vulnerable passengers. Isabella was walking now, taking tentative steps between furniture pieces in Carmen's living room, while Maria watched through video calls that bridged the distance between Denver and Phoenix. The baby's development reminded Maria of how much had changed since that difficult day at the airport when she had feared she might never meet her granddaughter. "Look, abuela," Isabella would babble, holding onto the coffee table while Maria cooed encouragement through the computer screen. The cross around Maria's neck would catch the light during these calls, its silver surface reflecting not just the afternoon sun, but the hope and purpose that had grown from crisis and trauma. The GPS device inside the cross continued its quiet vigilance, monitoring Maria's heart rhythm and ready to summon help if needed. But Maria's heart was strong now, sustained not just by medical technology, but by the knowledge that her experience had created lasting change that would protect countless other travelers from similar trauma. The technology would continue to guard her health, but it was the human connections forged in crisis and nurtured through advocacy that had transformed her from a victim of institutional failure into an agent of systemic reform. In the end, that's what the cross had always represented, not just faith in divine protection, but trust in the capacity of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when confronted with injustice and given the opportunity to choose compassion over convenience, dignity over protocol, and community over bureaucracy. As Maria prepared for another trip to Phoenix to visit Isabella, she touched her mother's cross and said a small prayer of gratitude for the technology that kept her safe, the family that gave her purpose, and the community of advocates who had helped transform her trauma into triumph. The GPS device would guide emergency responders to her location if needed, but it was the human GPS network of caring people she had discovered that would guide her toward whatever service and advocacy lay ahead. The silver surface of the cross caught the morning light as Maria headed to the airport, its familiar weight a reminder that some blessings multiply when shared, growing stronger rather than weaker when extended to others who need hope, help, and human kindness. In a complicated world where institutions sometimes fail, but individuals can still choose to stand up for what's right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.